Crockett by calling her the woke queen. But within just 5 minutes, Jasmine turned the entire courtroom against him and struck a blow so powerful it shattered his mask of neutrality. Her searing words captured millions of views, shaking America to its core. And when the dust finally settled, America had a new name for her. Not woke queen, but the true queen of justice. But what exactly did Jasmine say that left America holding its breath? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber in Washington, D.C. was a cathedral of power, wrapped in cold marble and older ambitions. High above Jasmine Crockett, the portraits of dead justices loomed, their faces carved in sepia, their gazes frozen in an era where her voice would have been a crime. The air inside felt metallic, a weight pressing against her ribs as she took her seat at the lone witness table. Across from her, the row of black-robed justices sat like an immovable mountain, with Chief Justice John Roberts at the summit, his expression a mask of detached superiority. Cameras hummed like insects in the corners. The nation was watching, but Jasmine knew few in this room were here to truly listen. The agenda on the docket was neatly typed: judicial equity and systemic racial bias. Words clean and clinical, masking the rot they pretended to examine. As Jasmine folded her hands before her, 1,000 untold verdicts, each soaked in injustice, seemed to pulse against the walls. The very architecture reeked of an old order pretending neutrality while clinging to its crown. And yet, sitting there in her black suit, her heart pounding but her spine unbending, Jasmine knew today silence would not save them. The silence in the room was a taut wire, stretched so tight that it seemed the mere weight of one word could snap it. And Chief Justice John Roberts, with the calm cruelty of a man who had snapped many before, finally spoke. "We welcome our woke queen to educate us today," he said, his tone lacquered in courtesy, yet sharpened with contempt. The words sliced through the chamber like a hidden blade, cloaked in silk but lethal in impact. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, stunned by the casual violence wrapped in protocol. Jasmine sat motionless, her spine a pillar of iron, her face unreadable, but the air around her seemed to thrum with a deeper, older fury. Across the gallery, aides and clerks shifted uncomfortably, the polished floor echoing tiny, nervous sounds. Reporters jerked their cameras into focus, the mechanical clicks suddenly deafening against the frozen quiet. Every lens swiveled, every pen poised, every eye burning toward her, waiting for a crack, a tear, a tremble. But Jasmine only blinked, slow and deliberate, absorbing the insult like a stone absorbs rain. In that charged silence, it was not Jasmine who seemed diminished. It was the room itself that shrank, exposed and meaner than before. The insult hung in the air like a slow poison, seeping into every corner of the room, daring anyone to pretend they hadn't heard. And it was Jasmine Crockett who bore the full weight of it. She sat perfectly still, her palms flat against the cool wood of the witness table, as if grounding herself against the sudden shift in the room's gravity. Around her, the oxygen seemed to thin, every breath tighter than the last. Robert's words floated above them all, an insult cloaked in civility, refusing to dissipate. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't twitch. She held herself steady, knowing that the smallest crack, a flinch, a frown, would be weaponized against her. Her silence was not submission. It was a blade, sharpened and sheathed, waiting for the moment to strike. Across the room, aides fidgeted, reporters scribbled furiously, but no one dared to speak, because everyone understood instinctively that a line had been crossed. The weight of history pressed against Jasmine's shoulders, a history that had always demanded people like her to endure mockery in silence or be condemned for anger. Seconds stretched unbearably, until time itself seemed to hold its breath, and still Jasmine sat, the embodiment of controlled defiance. Roberts leaned back slightly, mistaking the searing silence for weakness, his voice slicing again through the tension with a smooth and practiced cruelty. "Perhaps Her Majesty can explain to us," he said, an edge of mockery curling his words, "how a collection of grievances replaces the rule of law." This time no laughter followed. Even those predisposed to agree with him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling the unease settling into their bones. The cameras edged closer, desperate to catch the moment Jasmine might break. But all they found was a woman rooted so deeply in her own dignity that not even the Chief Justice of the United States could move her. The imbalance of power was naked now. A stage set against her, history weighed against her, the rules tilted from the start, and yet Jasmine's silence filled the courtroom more powerfully than any rebuttal could. She was not shrinking. She was waiting. The room expected her to explode. Maybe a raised voice, maybe a flash of anger. Something loud enough that they could dismiss her, label her unprofessional, emotional, out of control. That would have been easier for them to handle. But Jasmine Crockett didn't explode. She inhaled once, slowly, her back straightening as if pulled by some invisible thread of resolve. Then she reached forward and picked up a single sheet of paper, holding it with the same precision someone might use to lift a scalpel in an operating room. Her voice when it came was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was deliberate, calm, clear, and so sharp it made people flinch harder than any scream could. "If we're going to talk about law," she began, "then let's talk about what it looks like in practice, not in theory." She let the line breathe, her eyes sweeping across the room like a quiet storm rolling over dry land. The justices, the aides, the press, they all leaned forward, drawn in not by theatrics but by something far more dangerous. Truth, spoken without apology. She glanced at the document. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. The sentence landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet, soft in tone, devastating in impact. That's not because black people commit 5 times more crime. It's because the system has been designed, not accidentally but intentionally to police us harder, prosecute us faster, and punish us longer. The room didn't move, not even a cough. The data hung in the air like smoke that refused to rise. Jasmine didn't pause for effect. She paused because facts deserve space to echo. She continued, "For the same crimes, black defendants receive sentences that are, on average, 22% longer than white defendants. That's not anecdotal. That's Department of Justice data, publicly available, publicly ignored." She turned her gaze toward Roberts, not as a challenge, but as an anchor. Her words weren't floating. They were grounded in something he could not dismiss. She took her time, no rush. Every word carefully chosen, like chess moves designed to collapse the board, not just win the match. "And in capital punishment cases," she said, her voice low but cutting, "when the victim is white and the defendant is black, the chance of receiving the death penalty is 3 times higher." No one breathed. She didn't blink. "Let me say that again. Not 1.5 times. Not twice. 3 times higher." She leaned forward slightly, still seated, her fingers pressed gently against the table, as if to steady the entire weight of what she was about to say. "If justice is blind, then why does it see race so clearly when it decides who lives and who dies?" Someone near the back audibly shifted in their seat. The creak of leather echoed like a gunshot. But Jasmine didn't react to it. Her focus didn't waver. "These aren't just the statistics," she said, lifting the page slightly for everyone to see. "These are tombstones. These are prison doors. These are ruined families and children left behind. These numbers are names. Names that never mattered inside rooms like this until they were hashtags, until someone had to bury them." The emotion in her voice was present, not as fire, but as steel, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. "This system has always demanded that people like me, people who look like me, stay calm while being broken. We are told to wait, to trust, to believe in the process while it strips us bare. And when we speak, even quietly, we are mocked, labeled, minimized." She paused again, but not because she was unsure. It was the kind of pause that let history settle into the room, the kind that forced every person present to sit with what had just been said, and to wonder if the silence that followed meant agreement or shame. "I am not here to be congratulated for being articulate. I'm not here to be exoticized as the exception to your expectation. I'm here because this system keeps pretending that data like this doesn't speak loud enough. So let me be clear. I'm not emotional. I'm not making a scene. I'm presenting evidence. Hard, peer-reviewed, government-issued evidence. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then the discomfort belongs to you, not to me. Across the room, the temperature felt like it had dropped by degrees. Not because it was cold, but because everything human, breath, eye contact, posture, had shifted. Jasmine had turned the air itself into pressure, a quiet force that pushed back against every ounce of condescension that had hung in the chamber before she spoke. The cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. No questions were asked. No interruptions came. Jasmine folded the paper and placed it gently on the table, her fingers brushing the wood with care. Numbers don't lie, she said finally, but people do. And sometimes they build systems out of those lies and call it law. And with that, she leaned back in her chair. Not triumphant, not smug, just resolute, like someone who had dropped the truth in the middle of a room and didn't need to raise her voice to let it burn. The truth had been laid bare, raw and irrefutable. And like any empire built on denial, the first instinct of the powerful was not to reckon with it, but to discredit the one brave enough to speak it. Roberts didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power came not from volume, but from the slow precision of carefully chosen words, words that could wound while masquerading as decorum. He adjusted his robe, leaned forward slightly, and delivered his strike with surgical politeness. The judiciary is not a stage for emotional storytelling, he said, his voice as smooth as polished marble, but each syllable carrying the cold efficiency of a scalpel. The courtroom didn't gasp or murmur. The attack was too refined, too practiced. But its intent was unmistakable. He wasn't refuting Jasmine's facts. He was trying to reframe them as mere sentiment, as noise unworthy of serious minds. For a heartbeat, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Jasmine to react. Would she rise to the bait? Would she flare into righteous anger? The very reaction that centuries of prejudice had been trained to expect from women who looked like her? Jasmine did none of those things. She remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table, her shoulders square, her gaze steady. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble, didn't spike. It dropped lower, quieter, heavier, more dangerous. "Is truth emotional?" she asked, each word slow and deliberate. "Only when spoken by those who suffer from it?" The room seemed to tilt with the weight of that question. It was not a rebuttal. It was a mirror held up so ruthlessly that even those seated in judgment had to see their own reflection. Jasmine didn't fill the silence that followed. She let it stretch, let it deepen, forcing everyone in that grand, cold room to sit with what had been said. Reporters scribbled frantically. Aides shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even among the justices, a few eyes flickered away from her steady gaze. Roberts's face remained composed, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed the impact. In that moment, the battle between them sharpened into something colder and more primal. Not merely a debate about law, but an unmasking of who gets to define whose voice counts, and whose pain can be dismissed as performance. Pressure had a way of stripping even the most powerful men down to their truths. And in that tightening silence, Roberts's veneer of neutrality began to crack. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight stiffening of his posture, the faint clench of his jaw, the careful repositioning of papers that didn't need repositioning. But in a room trained to notice the invisible weight of power shifting, every micro-movement screamed. He cleared his throat lightly, as if to reassert dominance through sound alone. But when he spoke, the slip was immediate, irreversible. "We must protect the traditions of the legal system," Roberts said, his voice still smooth, but now carrying a brittle undertone that hadn't been there before, "rather than yield to every trend of artificial awakening." The moment the words left his mouth, the air changed. It was a subtle but undeniable shift, like the first creak of a dam under pressure, a hairline fracture in what had once seemed impenetrable. For a split second, the courtroom was paralyzed, the words hanging between marble walls, heavy with the realization of what had just occurred. Roberts, the Chief Justice, whose entire reputation had been built on the illusion of cold, apolitical fairness, had said the quiet part out loud. Not a neutral defense of the law, not a measured critique of procedural overreach. No, a value judgment, a choice. Tradition over progress, order over awakening, the old world over the inconvenient voices of the new. And the room reacted with the merciless efficiency of seasoned predators smelling blood. Reporters who had been merely observers a moment before suddenly came alive, their pens scraping against notepads like a sudden rainstorm, heads bent urgently over laptops. Camera operators refocused their lenses with renewed fervor. Aides to senators stiffened visibly, exchanging brief, sharp glances, already imagining the headlines, already calculating the fallout. Jasmine remained motionless at the witness table, her expression unreadable, but the tremor in the air around her spoke volumes. She didn't need to say a word. The damage had been self-inflicted, clean, undeniable, devastating. Robert seemed to realize it too, a fraction too late. His lips pressed into a tight line, his hands, once casually folded on the bench, now gripped the edge of his notes as if trying to steady himself. He could have walked it back, offered a clarifying statement, softened the language, buried the bias under another layer of judicial jargon. But he didn't. Pride, habit, and the stubborn belief in his own untouchability sealed his fate. He stayed silent, sitting inside the echo of his own misstep, while the rest of the room quietly shifted away from him, morally, politically, historically. Outside the courthouse, the media engines roared to life. Headlines began to materialize before the hearing even adjourned. Chief Justice Roberts criticizes artificial awakening. During historic testimony, Roberts defends legal tradition amidst accusations of racial bias. Neutral no more. Roberts's comments ignite firestorm. Tweets exploded across the digital landscape, pundits sharpening their knives in real time. Legal scholars who had once defended Roberts' centrism now hesitated. Their emails to networks and editorial boards suddenly tinged with a cautious distance. Civil rights organizations, watching live feeds, drafted statements within minutes, calling the comment what it was, a mask slipping. Back inside the chamber, the energy was electric but taut, like a storm building pressure but refusing to break. Even those sympathetic to Roberts, even those who had privately cheered when he had used the phrase woke queen, recognized that something irrevocable had shifted. A justice was supposed to be the architecture of restraint, a body immune to personal leanings, at least publicly. By framing modern civil rights movements as artificial awakenings, Roberts had done more than insult Jasmine Crockett. He had placed himself squarely on the battlefield he was sworn to referee. No longer the impartial guardian of the Constitution, now visibly, unmistakably, a soldier in a cultural war he pretended did not exist. And Jasmine, without rising, without speaking, had made it happen. She watched him with the patient gaze of someone who understood that true power was not in shouting a man down, but in letting him condemn himself with his own words. Every second that ticked by without Roberts clarifying, every quiet scribble from a reporter, every murmured message passed between aides, it all etched another line into the crumbling portrait of his once pristine judicial image. This wasn't just a gaffe, it was a revelation. And though Roberts still sat on the high bench, still wore the robes of authority, still held the gavel, somehow in a way that everyone in the room could feel but no one dared yet to say out loud, he had shrunk. The myth of his impartiality had cracked, and no amount of procedure, precedent, or polished rhetoric would ever fully mend it. The slip had cracked the mask, but it was Jasmine, patient, unblinking, who now prepared to drive the truth through the heart of the silence he had left behind. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't need to. Power wasn't something she chased. It was something she summoned. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hands flat against the witness table and rose to her feet, her movements unhurried, yet commanding the attention of every living soul in the room. She straightened her jacket with a careful tug, her eyes sweeping across the chamber, making sure no one, not a clerk, not a senator, not even Roberts himself, could pretend to look away. The marble walls, the mahogany furniture, Even the sacred emblems of justice carved into the architecture seemed to shrink against the weight of what was about to be said. "I choose to be awake," she began, her voice low, resonant, each syllable falling with the weight of a verdict, "because too many before me were forced to sleep through injustice." The words didn't crash. They didn't roar. They moved like an unstoppable tide, pressing into the consciousness of everyone present, forcing them to feel what history had always urged them to forget. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't pace or gesticulate. She simply stood there, steady and unshakable, letting the truth sit in the air like a stone too heavy to lift. "For generations," she continued, her voice threading through the thick silence, "entire communities were lulled, bullied, and terrorized into silence, told that survival meant obedience, that dignity meant submission, that justice was a prize too dangerous to reach for." Her hands didn't move, but her words carved deep. Awake was not just a word in her mouth. It was a state of being, a rebellion, a refusal to let injustice be the natural order of things. "I was not called here today to perform rage for your comfort," she said, her gaze briefly locking with Robert's, so piercing that even he, in his elevated seat, seemed suddenly smaller. "I was not summoned here to apologize for discomforting myths with measurable facts, and I will not apologize for refusing to sleep through another generation of sanctioned forgetting." A few aides in the back exchanged nervous glances. One senator shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat in a sound that echoed far too loudly in the otherwise still chamber. But Jasmine's voice only deepened, not louder but heavier, as if gravity itself was on her side. "The word woke has been weaponized," she said, her eyes scanning the room slowly, unflinchingly. "Twisted into a caricature of extremism by those who would rather defend the comfort of ignorance than face the cost of awareness. But at its core, it means something simple, something righteous." Her hand moved slightly, not pointing, but offering, as if daring anyone in the room to meet her where she stood. "It means refusing to sleep through the quiet violence that law and tradition too often conspire to hide." She paused, and not because she faltered, but because she understood the power of letting the silence expand around her words, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The reporters leaned closer over their notebooks. The cameras in the back, despite the courtroom's strict rules about movement, adjusted ever so slightly, desperate to capture every frame of this moment. "I choose to be awake," she said again, the repetition not a plea but a declaration, a hammer striking iron. "I choose to bear witness, to speak when silence would be easier, to remember when forgetting would be safer, to demand when compromise would be more polite." Each line built on the last, like stones laid one atop the other, constructing something undeniable, something larger than the marble monuments outside or the robes of office in front of her. "And if that makes me dangerous," she said, her voice quiet but vast, "then it is only because the truth has always been the greatest threat to a comfortable lie." For a moment, no one moved. No whispered consultations, no shuffling of papers. The very oxygen in the room felt charged, heavy, thick with the knowledge that something irreversible had just happened. Not because someone shouted, but because someone refused to lower their voice to make others comfortable. Robert sat utterly still, his expression unreadable. But his earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by something colder and tighter, like the foundation of certainty beneath him had shifted, and he hadn't found solid ground yet. The courtroom didn't explode into noise. It did something worse for those who had hoped to contain her. It held its breath. Jasmine stood there, alone and unbowed, her hands still resting calmly on the table in front of her, the embodiment of a truth that could no longer be laughed off, minimized, or reframed. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't seeking validation. She had claimed her space, her voice, and the meaning of the very word they had tried to weaponize against her. And she had done it so cleanly, so devastatingly, that the entire room had no choice but to listen. And in that breathless silence, the real verdict was already clear. The silence Jasmine left in her wake wasn't emptiness, it was pressure, and slowly, inevitably, it began to tilt the entire room toward her. At first, the shift was almost imperceptible. A slight leaning forward, a subtle recalibration of posture, the restless stillness of people realizing they were no longer witnesses to a performance, but to a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett had not raised her voice. She had not stormed or pleaded, and yet something in the very architecture of the chamber had begun to tilt, as if the center of gravity itself had moved to where she stood. Across the gallery, younger lawmakers, staffers in sharp suits, and senators fresh from hard-fought elections, found their carefully guarded neutrality slipping. Arms once crossed loosened, backs once stiffened by institutional loyalty softened. Some lowered their eyes not in dismissal, but in reflection, as if ashamed at how easily they had assumed who would be on the defensive today. The reporters sensed it too. Trained to chase blood, scandal, spectacle, they now found their pens chasing something rarer, truth spoken without apology. Notes that had begun as coverage of a woke clash now shifted subtly, reframing Jasmine not as a disruptor, but as a challenger to a crumbling orthodoxy. The phrases being written, phrases that would soon flood headlines and airwaves, no longer cast her as the caricature Roberts had so casually attempted to pin on her. Instead, words like poised, relentless, commanding surfaced in quiet, hurried shorthand across glowing laptop screens. Near the back of the room, clusters of legal aides huddled in hushed conversation, their whispers sharp and urgent, slicing through the chamber's heavy quiet. "Did he just compromise impartiality?" one whispered, leaning closer to another. "Isn't that a breach of the appearance clause?" murmured a second. They weren't discussing Jasmine's daring anymore. They were questioning Roberts's judgment, a man who, until minutes ago, had been presumed untouchable. The old balance of fear, deference, and hierarchy was fracturing under the weight of his own miscalculation, and no amount of polished rhetoric could pull it back into place. Roberts, for his part, sat rigidly, the muscles along his jaw clenching and unclenching in an unconscious rhythm. His hands, the same hands that had once steered the course of Supreme Court doctrine with effortless authority, now gripped the arms of his chair with a kind of desperate stillness, as if afraid that any movement would betray just how much ground he had already lost. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer clarifications. Perhaps he understood, far too late, that anything he said now would only deepen the chasm that had opened beneath him. And Jasmine, she didn't crow, she didn't gloat. She stood in stillness, in certainty, the calm at the center of the gathering storm. She understood, in the marrow of her bones, that power gained through rage can be dismissed as a spectacle. But power claimed through poise becomes something no institution can easily erase. The shift wasn't a wave, it was a slow gathering current, pulling more and more of the room into her orbit. Veteran journalists who had covered decades of hearings, who had seen every performance and posturing under the Capitol dome, now leaned forward with expressions not of skepticism, but something closer to awe. Legal analysts in the room were already recalibrating their post-hearing commentary, sensing the tectonic implications of what they had just witnessed. Even some of the older lawmakers, weathered by cynicism and entrenched habit, sat a little straighter, no longer looking at Jasmine as a problem to be neutralized, but as a force to be reckoned with. The murmured conversations grew, but not in challenge, in concern. Terms like ethical breach, appearance of bias, and potential censure floated through the air, brittle and sharp as glass. The realization was setting in. Roberts had not merely wounded himself, he had wounded the image of the court he was sworn to protect. His lapse wasn't personal anymore, it was institutional. And that, more than any fiery speech or viral clip, was what had begun to truly destabilize the room. Outside, beyond the marble walls, the ripple effects were already spreading. Social media feeds lit up with real-time quotes from Jasmine's speech, the hashtag #DasChan surging within minutes. Political commentators, usually divided along ideological lines, paused in their pre-scripted outrage to acknowledge the sheer composure, the devastating precision of what had just unfolded. Some right-wing pundits scrambled to reframe the story, But even their usual talking points felt hollow in the wake of Robert's blunder. Back in the hearing room, the final, unmistakable sign of the shift came not in words but in posture. A young senator, a Republican from a deep red state no less, subtly removed his reading glasses, folded his hands, and simply listened. No performative eye rolls, no theatrical sighs, just stillness, attention, respect. And in Washington, D.C., where optics are oxygen and silence speaks louder than any applause, that was a revolution all by itself. Jasmine remained motionless for a long moment, allowing the weight of her presence, the truth of it, to do its work. She hadn't seized power by shouting louder or by burning the room down. She had done something far more dangerous to the old order. She had changed the gravity of the space around her, without theatrics, without compromise, without fear. And as the eyes of the nation watched, it became clear. The center of the room no longer sat with the Chief Justice. It sat with the woman he had tried, and utterly failed, to diminish. The air in the room was no longer thick with resistance. It was charged with something rarer, heavier, the unbearable, undeniable weight of a truth too powerful to be denied. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not as a defendant, not as a petitioner, but as the living embodiment of a truth no longer willing to be marginalized. Every gaze in the room was locked on her, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it grow, let it saturate the space until even the walls seemed to lean in to listen. The journalists' pens hovered midair, the aides froze in their whispered scheming, and the senators sat stiff-backed, as if bracing for something they could not stop. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, her hands still resting lightly on the wood of the witness table, as if anchoring herself to the earth itself. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried an edge sharper than any weapon words had forged that day. "If truth wears a crown," Jasmine said, each syllable measured like the tolling of a bell, "then let it be forged in fire, not forged in fear." The sentence cut through the room like a blade through silk. Elegant, irreversible. No raise in volume. No theatrical gesture. Only the sheer, unrelenting gravity of what she said and what she meant. There was a beat, a moment when time itself seemed to hesitate, as if even the laws of physics had been caught off guard. Then came the sound. The sharp, almost startled crack of palms meeting palms, a single person rising to their feet at the far side of the chamber. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the chamber, a room designed to intimidate dissent into silence, was standing, clapping, the sound rolling through the air like a wave too vast to resist. Not everyone rose immediately. Some, loyal to the old order, remained seated, their faces carved into stone, refusing to acknowledge the shifting tide. But it didn't matter. The momentum had broken past them, washing over marble and tradition alike. A new energy taking root where fear and deference once ruled. The applause wasn't wild. It wasn't the desperate roar of a rally or the messy chaos of protest. It was something quieter, heavier, more reverent. The sound of acknowledgement, recognition. The acknowledgement that something sacred had just happened, and no one, no title, no political allegiance could unsee it. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood there, allowing the moment to belong not to her ego, but to the truth she had unleashed. Her body was still, but there was an electricity humming beneath her skin. Not adrenaline, but something purer. Vindication, survival. The profound, unspeakable triumph of having spoken truth to power and watching power stagger beneath its weight. Across the dais, John Roberts sat frozen, his hands white-knuckled on the edge of his desk. His face was blank, carefully composed, but his body betrayed him. The faint slump of his shoulders, the downward tilt of his gaze. For all his years atop the judicial pyramid, for all his mastery of law and precedent, he now found himself naked before a force he had never been taught to reckon with. Moral clarity. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He bowed his head, a gesture small enough to miss, but seismic in its meaning. For a man who had once believed himself the final arbiter of what justice could and could not mean, it was not just a concession, It was a collapse. Jasmine's eyes didn't linger on him. She had not come here to humiliate a man. She had come here to expose a system, and she had done so with such precise, devastating elegance that it rendered all personal animosity irrelevant. In that moment, it didn't matter who had mocked her, who had underestimated her, who had tried to paint her advocacy as artificial awakening. The reality stood immutable before them all. Justice could no longer be hidden behind marble walls and carefully scripted decorum. It had a face now. It had a voice, and it was awake. The applause began to ripple through the gallery. First the staffers, then the aides, then even a handful of veteran lawmakers whose careers had been built on cautious neutrality. Journalists, too hardened by years of scandal to usually react to anything, found themselves clapping, their faces a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Not for a show, not for a headline, but because somewhere, in the marrow of their being, they recognized the authenticity standing before them. As the clapping crescendoed, Roberts remained seated, hands folded tightly together, his face turned slightly downward, a statue of defeat. It wasn't just the loss of an argument. It wasn't even the loss of a political moment. It was the visible, irrevocable crumbling of the myth of unassailable, neutral authority. In Washington, myths fall hard, and when they do, the earth shakes. Jasmine waited, letting the applause crest and settle into a powerful, resonant silence. Not the awkward kind that demands someone speak, but the sacred kind that demands everyone listen inwardly. She allowed herself a breath, a grounding in the gravity of what had just happened, before gathering her papers with unhurried grace. No grand gestures, no victory dance, just the quiet certainty of someone who had come to speak, had spoken, and had seen the very architecture of power shift because of it. The sergeant-at-arms, usually a silent ceremonial presence, straightened imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that history had been made here today. Not by decree, but by defiance. Even the court reporter, her fingers flying over the stenograph, looked up for a heartbeat, catching a glimpse of something she knew she would tell her grandchildren about. Jasmine stepped back from the witness table, the heels of her shoes clicking once, twice against the marble floor. A sound that echoed longer than it should have, as if the building itself were reluctant to let her leave. She nodded once, not to Roberts, not to the committee, but to the idea of justice itself, and turned to walk out of the chamber. The cameras captured it all. The silence, the bowed heads, the lone figure moving steadily through a battlefield where truth, for once, had not only survived but prevailed. And outside, where the city of Washington sprawled beneath an uncertain sky, 1,000 stories began to write themselves. But none would be able to erase what had been carved, word by word, into the soul of that room. Jasmine Crockett had not just won a moment. She had shifted a narrative. And once shifted, the ground would never be the same again. The walls of the hearing room might have gone still, but beyond them, the world was already catching fire. And this time, it was a fire lit not by rage, but by something even more dangerous: hope. The clip went viral before Jasmine even reached the courthouse steps. At first, it was shared cautiously. A few aides, a few journalists, a handful of civil rights groups that recognized the seismic energy of what had happened. Then came the avalanche. Within 2 hours, Jasmine's closing declaration was trending across every major social media platform. Within 6, it had leapt beyond the political echo chambers into the living rooms of ordinary people. Mothers washing dishes, students on buses, factory workers on lunch breaks, all pausing to watch a woman, calm and unshaken, declare that truth must be forged in fire, not in fear. By the 12-hour mark, the numbers were staggering. 50 million views, 50 million sets of eyes watching the moment a courtroom built to contain dissent instead witnessed the coronation of a new kind of leadership. Clip after clip played on loop. News anchors with solemn faces breaking script to acknowledge the gravity, podcasts erupting with urgent bonus episodes, YouTubers dissecting every line like theologians parsing sacred text. And across every screen, one phrase blazed like a banner carried into battle: the true Queen of Justice. It wasn't a title Jasmine had asked for. It wasn't one she had ever sought, but it was one the world seemed determined to place on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as an affirmation. In a time starved for authentic voices, she had not demanded the crown. She had simply stood in the fire, and when the smoke cleared, no one else remained. Major networks replayed the moment Roberts bowed his head. Analysts spoke of it in stunned tones usually reserved for seismic political upheavals or the ends of wars. In 20 years covering D.C., one veteran correspondent admitted on CNN, "I have never seen a power shift happen in real time like this." On Fox News, despite frantic efforts to spin the narrative, even the angriest panelists faltered when faced with the raw composure of Jasmine's closing statement. They could attack the word woke all they wanted, but they couldn't erase what the world had seen: dignity under siege, refusing to fall. In black churches from Atlanta to Detroit, Sunday sermons echoed with her words. In college campuses from Berkeley to Howard, classrooms erupted into discussions not just about law, but about courage, about what it meant to be awake in a system built to reward sleepwalking. The phrase Jasmine had given birth to, simple, searing, irrefutable, was already moving beyond her control. Stay woke, rule justly. It was spray-painted across brick walls by dawn. It was scrawled across handmade signs held by high school students walking out of classrooms. It was pinned to jackets, stitched into hoodies, carved into the bones of a generation that had been waiting not for a hero, but for permission to believe again. Civil rights organizations, some of them weary from decades of incremental battles, suddenly found themselves breathing different air. New petitions bore Jasmine's words as their rallying cry. Protest organizers printed them across banners so large they could be seen from helicopters. Lawyers quoted them in briefs challenging outdated laws. Activists wove them into chants that thundered through city streets long after midnight. In back rooms and green rooms and editorial meetings, powerful people scrambled to adjust. Some sought to co-opt Jasmine's words, soften them, make them palatable. Others plotted how to outflank her, to drown her message under manufactured scandals. But it didn't matter. A movement once dismissed as too fractured, too idealistic, had found a rallying point too clean, too undeniable to be easily deflected. Jasmine herself watched the wildfire from a small, dimly lit apartment far from the marble corridors where the battle had begun. She didn't revel in it. She didn't fear it. She accepted it, the way a soldier accepts the weight of armor before stepping onto the field. Fame was irrelevant. Titles were irrelevant. What mattered was the shift she could feel vibrating through the country's skin, the awakening of something that had been beaten down but not extinguished. In Washington, the hearing was officially closed. The gavel had fallen. The chairs were emptied. On the surface, the machinery of governance churned on, unaffected. But those who understood the undercurrents knew better. The hearing had not ended anything. It had only begun something no one could quite predict or control. The battle for justice, real justice, awake and unrelenting, had been renewed. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in clarity, in the unwavering conviction that truth, once spoken plainly enough, could shift the weight of entire institutions. Jasmine had not burned the system down. She had shown the cracks already there and forced a nation to look at them without blinking. Outside the courthouse, crowds began to gather, not chanting slogans of rage, but singing songs of endurance, of resilience, of long-denied hope. Some carried candles. Some carried copies of the Constitution. Some carried nothing but their own battered belief that change was still possible. The air buzzed with the kind of electricity that usually precedes a storm. But this wasn't a storm of destruction. It was a storm of rebirth. And at its center stood Jasmine Crockett, not because she had sought to be anointed, but because she had dared to speak the kind of truth that no gavel, no tradition, no crown of polished lies could suppress. A chapter had ended, but a new war, one fought not with the weapons of oppression, but with the unbreakable armor of awakened conscience, had just begun. And this time, the battle lines would not be drawn by those desperate to sleep. They would be drawn by those who had chosen, finally, to stay awake. The fires Jasmine had ignited couldn't be unseen, but the old order had survived longer storms, and they knew survival didn't come from admitting defeat. It came from controlling the story. In the polished war rooms of Washington and New York, the backlash began within hours of Jasmine's speech hitting 10 million views. These were rooms few outsiders ever entered. Leather-paneled, air thick with cigar smoke, lined with portraits of men who believed history was theirs to dictate, not endure. Inside, lobbyists, consultants, senior strategists, and political operatives gathered in tense huddles, their phones lighting up with panicked texts and subject lines marked urgent. The mood was not rage, it was fear. They had underestimated her, a first and a mistake they would not allow to happen again. Jasmine hadn't just embarrassed Roberts. She hadn't just embarrassed the institutions that protected him. She had done something far worse. She had exposed the rot, surgically, publicly, and without raising her voice. That made her not just a threat to one hearing, one man, one day. She was a threat to the entire architecture of deference that kept power intact. By noon, the first emergency meeting was underway in a K Street office tower. On the walls, television streaming cable news coverage of Jasmine's speech on an endless loop. On the long glass table, dossiers, private files, opposition research folders being thumbed through by pale, sweating hands. "She's not just another flash in the pan," muttered a veteran GOP strategist, his tie loosened, his voice tense. "She's articulate, disciplined, impossible to bait. She's dangerous." "What do we have on her?" asked a media consultant, fingers drumming the table. Not enough. That was the problem. Her record was clean, her activism too solid, her courtroom wins undeniable. There were no affairs, no shady businesses, no dirty financials that could be twisted into scandal. And worse, she refused to center herself. There were no ego trips to exploit, no self-aggrandizing interviews to pick apart. They realized in real time what made Jasmine unstoppable. She wasn't playing for fame. She was playing for the future. So they changed tactics. If they couldn't destroy the messenger, they would contaminate the message. By 3 p.m., the Whisper campaign had begun. Conservative think tanks circulated memos to friendly journalists, claiming that Jasmine's speech represented an escalation of racial division. Anonymous op-eds appeared in high-profile outlets, arguing that wokeness was undermining the rule of law. Social media bots flooded Twitter and Facebook with neatly phrased talking points. Real justice is colorblind. Stay woke. More like stay divided. We need unity, not extremism. By evening, the more aggressive narratives surfaced. Jasmine was framed as dangerously radical, a divisive figure out of touch with everyday Americans, a symbol of the left's attempt to politicize the courts. Cable news segments, prepackaged and coordinated, popped up like weeds. Some experts argued Jasmine's speech was emotional, not factual. Others accused her of grandstanding for social media fame. One anchor smirking over the Chiron, the woke takeover. Zrenia mocked her as the self-proclaimed queen of justice. And behind it all, the oldest playbook in American politics worked silently. Isolate, discredit, dismiss. But it wasn't just the media machine whirring into motion, it was political too. Far more dangerous. Senators met in closed-door sessions, discussing whether an ethics review of Jasmine's role in the hearing could be warranted. A few quietly floated the idea of investigating her past cases for irregularities. Fundraising emails were blasted to conservative donors, warning of an aggressive new leftist movement threatening the judiciary itself. The backlash wasn't about debating Jasmine's points. It was about smothering the space she had opened, before too many others dared to walk through it. Inside the White House, aides updated the president's briefing notes. Jasmine's name now appeared under emerging political threats. In Silicon Valley boardrooms, executives debated whether boosting her clips would politicize their platforms. Everywhere, the machine spun faster, more desperate, trying to reassert control before the story slipped too far from their grip. But it was already too late, because something had shifted that could not be unseen. In barbershops in Atlanta, in bodegas in New York, in diners in rural Alabama, ordinary Americans, people who rarely agreed on much, were replaying Jasmine's words. Not because they loved wokeness, not because they loved her politics, but because they recognized something older, deeper, more dangerous to the status quo. They recognized truth, spoken plainly, spoken without apology, and once heard it could not be unheard. Meanwhile, Jasmine watched it all unfold from a battered rental apartment near Capitol Hill, her phone vibrating nonstop with updates, warnings, threats, offers. "Be careful," her chief of staff told her quietly, standing by the window. "They're going to come after you harder than you've ever seen." Jasmine nodded once. Calm, she understood the stakes. She had dared to name the system. Now the system would try to erase her. But she wasn't afraid. She hadn't stood up that day for approval. She hadn't spoken for applause. She hadn't challenged Roberts for headlines. She had spoken because the silence had become unbearable. Because too many before her had whispered when they should have roared. Because justice wasn't supposed to be polite. And if they thought fear could put her back to sleep, they had misunderstood the entire lesson. She wasn't awake because it was easy. She was awake because there was no other choice left. Across the city, another war room gathered late into the night. This one wasn't filled with lobbyists. It wasn't lined with marble and mahogany. It was a cramped basement office lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. It was filled with organizers, students, teachers, retired judges, all watching Jasmine's speech for the 10th, 20th, 50th time. They didn't see a scandal. They didn't see a queen. They saw a mirror. They saw a map. They saw a new way forward. And as the night deepened and the backlash roared louder in the halls of power, they began to build phone trees, voter registration drives, legal clinics, readying themselves for a fight that would not end in a viral moment, but in systemic change. They would stay awake. They would rule justly. And no amount of smear campaigns, no amount of manufactured outrage would put them back to sleep again. Not after Jasmine Crockett. Not after what they had seen. Not after what they had finally fully begun to believe. The backlash roared. It clawed. It spun. It lashed out with every tool sharpened by decades of unchallenged authority. But the fire Jasmine had lit didn't flicker. It spread. Not because of a viral clip. Not because of a trending hashtag. Because somewhere deep beneath the noise, ordinary people, the ones who had been told for too long to sit down, shut up, and trust broken systems, felt something shift inside them. And once awakened, they would not sleep again. In cities and towns Jasmine had never even visited, her words echoed, not on stages or podiums, but in living rooms, barbershops, church halls, school cafeterias. Stay woke, rule justly, simple, seismic. In Detroit, a teenager printed Jasmine's closing statement on the back of his graduation gown. When he crossed the stage to receive his diploma, every family in the auditorium rose and clapped. Not just for him, but for the future he carried on his shoulders. In Birmingham, a retired school teacher, who had marched for voting rights in 1965, taped a handwritten poster to her front porch. "I stayed awake then. I'm staying awake now." In Los Angeles, a group of young lawyers launched a grassroots legal defense network offering free counsel to protesters, low-income tenants, and immigrants, proudly naming their project after Jasmine's words, "Fire-forged justice." The machine had thrown everything at her: doubt, mockery, fear. And still the torch moved from hand to hand, growing brighter, stronger, impossible to extinguish. Jasmine saw the movement rising but refused to let it become about her. When news crews flooded her office with interview requests, begging for exclusives, she declined them all. When publishers dangled lucrative book deals, promising bestsellers, she pushed them away. Every time a pundit tried to brand her the face of a revolution, she corrected them with the same steady voice she had used in that courtroom. "This isn't about me, it's about us. All of us." And the refusal made her even more powerful. In a world obsessed with personalities, Jasmine gave them principle. In a culture addicted to celebrity, she gave them solidarity. She didn't offer herself as a messiah. She offered a mirror and asked the nation to see itself clearly for the first time in generations. It terrified the old guard more than any speech ever could. The attacks kept coming. Cable news commentators pivoted. painting the movement not as dangerous but as naive. Awake but reckless, one editorial sneered. Well-intentioned but unrealistic, said another. In secret memos, think tanks plotted new strategies, co-opt the language, dilute the message, sell the dream of justice without any of the sacrifice. But the fire had already passed beyond their reach. It was carried by mothers teaching their children history not found in textbooks, by warehouse workers striking for fair pay, chanting Jasmine's words into empty streets until the walls shook, by students rewriting school board policies, quoting her speech line by line until dusty rules bent to awakened will. Stay woke. Rule justly. The system could not kill what no longer lived in one woman's voice, but in millions. At night, Jasmine sometimes sat alone in her small, windowless office, watching the movement bloom across glowing screens. Protests she hadn't called, petitions she hadn't written, victories she hadn't orchestrated, and she smiled. Not out of pride, but out of something rarer. Faith. She had planted a seed, yes, but it had grown into something wild, uncontrollable, beautiful, and it belonged to them now. In New Orleans, a city council passed a sweeping criminal justice reform package after activists flooded hearings quoting Jasmine's address to the committee. In Atlanta, a freshman state legislator stood on the House floor and recited the full text of Jasmine's closing argument, daring anyone to vote against conscience. In Portland, an elementary school teacher asked her third graders to write essays answering the question Jasmine had left hanging in the air. What does it mean to rule justly? The essays broke hearts and hardened resolve. Children wrote about fairness not as a political theory, but as a birthright. Woke didn't mean radical to them. It meant awake enough to see hurt, strong enough to heal it. Meanwhile, the old power structures faltered under their own weight. Attempts to reframe Jasmine's speech as divisive were met with rolling laughter online. Editorials wringing their hands about too much activism were buried under waves of reader backlash. Politicians who tried to dismiss the movement found themselves shouted down at town halls, not with insults, but with pointed questions they couldn't answer without betraying their own fear. And still, Jasmine refused the spotlight. When asked to lead marches, she deferred to local organizers. When asked to run for higher office, she simply said, "I don't need a bigger title. We need a bigger awakening." There were nights the loneliness pressed against her, the knowledge that every step forward would come with new enemies, new betrayals. But she bore it without bitterness, because the price was worth the prize. Not fame, not favor, but a generation that would not sleep through injustice again. And somewhere, in a suburban neighborhood, a farming town, a sprawling city skyline, someone new woke up each day and whispered her words under their breath like a prayer. Stay woke. Rule justly. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a mandate. And no matter how fierce the machine's backlash became, no matter how many storms they unleashed, they could not put the fire out, because it didn't live in headlines. It lived in hearts. It lived in action. It lived in a country that had finally opened its eyes and seen itself clearly enough to rise. The fires Jasmine had lit were no longer just battles for policy or courtroom victories. They had become something deeper, something that forced every soul watching to ask a question far more terrifying than, what comes next? The real question was, what will you choose to see, and what will you choose to become? The story of Jasmine Crockett was never just about one woman standing against a rigged machine. It was about the invisible weight so many have carried, the cold architecture of systems designed not to explode in scandal, but to suffocate slowly in silence. Jasmine didn't shatter those walls with rage or rebellion. She did it with the far more dangerous weapon of truth. Truth spoken plainly, truth endured without apology, truth that refused to blink even when the full force of tradition, power, and cynicism demanded she lower her gaze. Her greatest victory wasn't the applause or the viral headlines. It was forcing a sleeping world to see itself, not as it wished to be, but as it truly was. And in that unflinching reflection, she offered something almost forgotten in a world exhausted by betrayals. The reminder that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to mistake fear for fate. The lesson buried inside Jasmine's battle is brutally simple. Power never concedes because it sees reason. It concedes because it is made to see itself, naked and trembling, before a conscience it cannot kill. Systems built on injustice do not collapse from argument. They collapse from endurance, from truth laid down like rails until the train of history has no choice but to follow. Jasmine's refusal to be reduced, to be mocked, shamed, or softened, showed that the hardest battle is not fighting the enemy across the aisle, but surviving the exhaustion of being doubted, diminished, and dismissed for daring to dream beyond the boundaries of a broken design. Her resilience teaches that victory is not a moment captured on screens. It is the stubborn, relentless decision to remain standing even when the ground itself trembles to throw you down. The human message left in the wake of her movement burns hotter than any policy debate could capture. Awakening is not a comfort. It is a cost. To stay woke, truly consciously awake, is to choose daily the pain of seeing what others are allowed to ignore. It is choosing to love a country that has not always loved you back. Choosing to believe in justice when injustice pays better. Choosing to fight not because the odds favor you, but because silence dishonors the ones who fought before you. Jasmine's story is a map for every soul who has ever stood at the edge of despair and wondered if speaking mattered. It mattered. It matters. It will always matter. And yet the story warns. The system will not kneel easily. It will camouflage itself in new words, new faces, new promises. It will pretend to reform while sharpening its knives in the dark. The backlash will be swift, the smears inevitable, the betrayals heartbreaking. But what Jasmine revealed, what every cracked facade could not contain, is this simple, terrifying, beautiful truth. Once eyes have been opened, they do not close willingly again. Once a soul has stood in the light, even the deepest shadow cannot claim it without a fight. The message carved from her journey is not for the faint-hearted. It is not a lullaby sung over protests. It is a battle cry written in the veins of every person who refuses to unsee injustice simply because comfort demands it. It says, do not mistake politeness for peace. Do not mistake tradition for truth. Do not mistake the crown offered by the old world for the fire-forged freedom earned by those awake enough to burn the myths to the ground. Jasmine's final lesson isn't that truth wins easily, it's that truth wins slowly, painfully against the full machinery of resistance. But when it wins forever. And now the torch lies in the hands of those willing to carry it forward, battered but unbroken, scarred but unyielding. The question left in the ash of Jasmine's courtroom stand is not whether injustice still lives. It does. The real question is, who among us will choose to stay awake? Who among us will choose to rule justly, not when it is popular, not when it is easy, but when the fire demands that you forge yourself harder, louder, clearer than fear would ever allow? Because in the end, the lesson is not that Jasmine Crockett changed the system in a day. It's that she refused to let the system change her. And somewhere, across 1,000 quiet rooms, 1,000 flickering screens, 1,000 open eyes, 1,000 ready hearts, the torch she lit will burn long after the marble crumbles and the old names are forgotten. Stay woke, rule justly, endure the fire, forge the future. The choice has never been more brutal, and it has never been more clear. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.